cloud, so to speak, is just a bunch of computers on a super fast network. That's basically all it is. When you download something, when you download something from a remote computer, you're essentially connecting to a computer with an IP address, and that's called a client. That client downloads something from the internet over something I'll cover later what's the best way to describe this? Let's just say in terms of networking, right? Like so, you basically I'll cover it later. It's called TCP, TCP/IP, and HTTP, right? Like so, again, super basic concepts. So why do I need to cover this? Well, it turns out whenever you hear about machine learning in production, 99% of the time it's that buzzword REST API. Starting a server on a REST API, it's listening on a portal, right? 99% of the time, that's what you're doing, right? Like so, a prerequisite to actually understand how to deploy a model and make it remotely accessible on the internet is you need to understand networking. I know it doesn't seem intuitive at first, but this is literally 99% of the time. This is what you're dealing with. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't get covered in tutorials. If you want a picture of the terms and stuff, it's all in the meetup link. The meetup link has a direct link to this. So I'm not hiding anything from here. It's all on GitHub, all open source. And as I go, as I link to things, I will post direct link as comments on the meetup. So that way you can follow along remotely locally on your computer here. So anytime you want to build something on the internet, you need to expose it remotely somehow. Right? Like so that can happen either locally on your desktop, or it can happen on your laptop, or it can happen remotely on the internet. So maybe you get some free Google Cloud credits or Amazon credits, and you start up a virtual machine. I'll actually cover what those things are later. But just think of it for now as a computer you can remotely access somehow, just like your laptop, right? So you have an individual laptop, you have an individual thing with an operating system, right? Like so that could be Linux, Windows, or Mac. 99% of the time, it's going to be Linux, right? Like so, the reason a lot of people use Mac, for example, is it's the same command line, same concepts, but it's easier to use Linux. But whenever you get into the Linux world, 99% of the time, or whenever you get into production, 99% of the time, it's going to be Linux server. You guys are probably going to want to sit maybe like back there, maybe you see. Yeah, 99% of the time, that's going to be the Linux world. So one thing I would also get comfortable with is command line. If you're used to Windows, install maybe something like I can recommend like MSys, MSys2, which is a set of MSYS2 for those Windows people. If not, if you're on Mac, you can use Brew. Brew is basically your app store. That's going to cover most things you're probably going to need. And then from there, when you want to run Linux locally, a lot of people nowadays are using Docker for that. So for what it's worth, Docker has actually been around since like 2012. It took off in like 2015, and then from there, like this whole container thing happened. For what it's worth, containers have actually been around since Linux's creation. Or actually, not quite, but like a couple years in. Very early though. Containers are actually a very old technology. Docker just added a wrapper on top of it. And then it became kind of this neat abstraction layer later on. I'll cover containers in depth as well. But you really need to understand like what is a networking thing. So I have an IP address. This is like you connect to something, you connect to a network. This is your address, this is your number on the local network. So this could be 98.6 whatever. Whenever you deal with your router or connect to Wi-Fi, you have an IP address. Next is a host name. So whenever you go to google.com, you get an IP address. So what does that look like in practice? Well, it turns out I can go to so if I go to google.com, right? What am I doing in practice? You ever use the developer tools before? If you haven't, you can open your browser, right click. Well, actually, I'm assuming most of you use Chrome, but if you use Firefox, it's similar. You just do right click and inspect, and you have something called the developer tools. And in there is this idea of a network. So you can do this with any website you want, right? Like, so I can just click, see, and all this stuff comes up. So your web browser is actually just a point-and-click thing that allows you to access a network. That's all it is, right? And so all these things we're used to every day, like Google.com, that's just a host name, right? And then that host name calls back to a computer with an IP address. That IP address is that number, again, that's connected, that's basically its address on the internet. It's an individual number, right? And so when you're dealing with networking, there's generally, one thing you need to think of is a local address only and a publicly accessible address. So you probably get confused because one computer on the cloud can have like 3 or 4 different IP addresses. You're like, what are all these things? Well, it turns out, chances are, most of the time, you need to make your computer remotely accessible, right? In order to do that, you need to actually expose it publicly, right? Like so, a network itself is actually can either be a local network like this, where it's closed off. It can be a company-only network, or it can be a remote network on the internet somewhere. All the concepts are the same, though. You have a host name and you have an IP address. So let's start by zooming in on that. Whenever you deal with a network, right? You connect. You have a host name. This is something called this host name is you have something called DNS, domain specific. So domain name is basically domain name specification. So a domain name is, when you register on the internet, you register with a host name like your favorite product, like myproductname.io or whatever, myproductname.ai. You are all probably looking to do AI startups at some point. So if you were to build a website and you have a .ai domain, right? That has to point to some backend address, right? So that backend address is a server that you create on AWS or what have you, right? So you have to set up all these external things. I'm not going to cover all that today just because we only have 4 hours and most of you here from machine learning. But I will just tell you in general that you need to set up a domain name and you need to point it to a backend server with a remotely accessible IP address. That's a prerequisite. And knowing these terms is a prerequisite even to getting started with actually just running your model on the internet. Does anyone have any particular questions? I don't, this isn't a networking class. I just want to make sure that you have some terms you can look up later. Do the basics make sense? You have a number, and then you have a host name. That host name is like a friendly interface, Google.com, what have you, and it points to a backend number. That's an individual server. From there, one thing I guess I should note is a loopback address. So how many of you have ever typed localhost? You weren't sure what it did maybe. So when you type localhost, that's called the loopback address. An alias for that is 127.0.0.1. This is the equivalent of the IP address. So this is your IP, for your loopback address, that just loops back to itself. That's all it does. So it's a locally running server. It's only on your laptop. So you can use the IP address, or you can use the host name. That's why you have to know what that means. Both 127.0.0.1 and localhost are the same thing. Localhost is an alias for that IP address. Another one, if you want to make, say you're on a remote server and you want to expose it on the internet. It turns out you can't use localhost to do that. So if you say listen on localhost, it'll only let you connect if it's locally on the computer. If you want to expose it globally, you actually use a different IP address, 0.0.0.0. So that's saying allow my model to be exposed on the public internet outside this computer, right? Like so, there's a big distinction between local and remote, right? Like so, your local development environment generally uses localhost or 127.0.0.1. So again, it's imperative you understand these things, right? Like so, if you just want to start a model, then you need to even run it on a server. If you generally what you do if you're doing Python, if you've ever used there's a Python web server. Do most of you program in Python? I assume. Okay, then you're using. Have you ever used Flask before? Okay, yeah. So you know one of the things you have to do is you have to make Flask listen in 0.0.0.0. Yep. That's what that means. So there's a distinction there, right? So I'm going to zoom past these concepts, and then anything you want me to zoom in on, let me know. Again, I want to get to the model serving as soon as possible and make sure that you're not on board to death here. This is just a lecture while you're downloading Docker and setting things up. So while I'm doing this, while we're going through some of the prerequisite concepts, make sure you're downloading Docker. Go to the meetup, pick your operating system, Linux, Windows, or Mac, get that link, make sure you're running the install while I'm doing this lecture. Does anyone need help? For Windows and Mac, it should be like a point-and-click install. Do you need help?
My logic is not support that we just get for.
Okay, this is what we're here for. Okay, hold on. Come on. All right.